All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Benedikt here, who's Vice Chair and CEO of the Munich Security Conference. I'm Robbie Grammer. I'm a national security reporter with Politico. I run our NatSec daily newsletter, which my mom recently called one of the best written newsletters that she has ever read. So there's your endorsement. Subscribe if you haven't already. But we're here on the heels of this Munich security leaders meeting, where dozens of top officials convened and met in Washington here to discuss the next steps of the transatlantic relationship, especially in the Trump era. And I want to start with JD Vance. The vice president gave a speech this morning to this group that was on record. It was a different tone than the speech he gave in Munich in February at the Munich Security Conference. The February speech was very fiery, very critical of Europe. This one today, he talked about, the importance of working together, avenues for cooperation with Europe. So I guess my question is, which JD Vance should we believe? The bad cop JD Vance of February or the good cop JD Vance that we saw today?
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for having me. Obviously, you've got your mother under better control than I do. Whereas your mother praises your work, my mother at the beginning of this trip said, "Why are you going over to the US again? Isn't all lost?" See, the reason why we came once again is exactly to have the kinds of moments that we've produced with the vice president today. In fact, one minor correction to your question. The key thing about today's event was that it was not a speech. The vice president came to Munich and delivered a speech and then somehow forgot the Q&A part of it. And we have now made up for that by involving him in a highly interactive discussion. We had questions that were pre-agreed from members of the audience. And I think the fact that he took questions, that the office didn't tell us which questions to take and which ones were off limits. And the fact that he answered all of them in great detail, I thought in a very constructive tone, is an important signal. I do also believe that the speech in Munich was an important signal. And I keep saying, and this is my personal opinion and don't share it with my boss all that often, that while there are some who say that wasn't a foreign policy speech in Munich, that it was more of a preaching, scolding speech, I thought it was a pretty impressive foreign policy speech. If you judge the speech not by some of the exotic examples, if you judge the speech not by the preaching tone, if you judge the speech solely on whether it achieved its intended effect, I think it was great, because I believe the intended effect of that speech in Munich was to really freak us out, to really wake us up. After, and good old friends like Bob Helms in the first row can attest to this, after for 60 years we've seen American after American on our stage in Munich try the same kind of wake-up diplomacy. What we've seen in Munich was pressure point diplomacy. Twisting the arm and you actually know what happens. And
so 3 months out, did it work?
Yeah, I think it worked.
Okay.
I would argue that without that speech and without the resulting outrage, you would have never, ever seen the kind of consolidated European response. You would have never seen a loosening of the debt brake, never in Germany. And that for us is a huge thing. It will allow us to spend upwards of 3% on defense from now on. It has made a huge difference. It was not comfortable, but it worked.
JD Vance today talked about 5%, how it's a talking point you hear from this administration. Enough with this 2%. Europe barely got there, but now we want to spend 5% of GDP on defense. Is that realistic or feasible at all for Europe? And if the Americans keep moving the goalpost, doesn't this just set up another round of battles between the Trump administration and Europe for not spending enough?
I think moving the goalposts is a well-tested strategy and it has its limits. But let's look at the reality. It's not about GDP, it's about capabilities. We in Germany, for example, and we in Europe, we've made promises to NATO when it comes to fulfillment of the defense plans. We are far from having met these promises. And so I think what you will see at the next NATO summit in less than 7 weeks is a focus. Yes, I'm sure there will be a percentage thing agreed, but you may be surprised to find that there'll be added to it some kind of capability requirement. And that I feel much more comfortable about arguing over than this totally random number, which, in years when the economy is good, is a lot bigger than in years when the economy is bad. And that's totally counter-cyclical and not the right thing to do. So focusing on capabilities rather than GDP is the thing to do.
So, on the economy front, there's a bit of a tariff war going on. Can you talk about the impact that will have on Europe's race to rearm?
See, I have some sympathy for those in the current US administration who say we need to sort of redesign some of our trade with Europe and China in particular. But I see and hear far too little discussion about the thing that you're alluding to, namely that this tariff war comes at a time when we need every euro in Europe to focus on defense. And slowing down our economic growth, damaging our export model at a time when we need that money to fulfill the promise we've made to NATO, I think isn't perfectly well thought through.
And has that, you've been in DC for 2 days. Do you feel like that message has gotten through to the right corners of the administration working on these negotiations, or not yet?
Yes, I also believe that at times like these, when things change, in the morning, at lunch and at dinner, it actually pays to step back a few steps and let things play out and not react to every single, tariff decision. And I think this is what you'll see from Europe in the next couple of weeks. We will wait this out on one level, and we will showcase a readiness to engage at another.
This is all happening as the Trump administration tries to advance these negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to finally end this war. There's been some concern among some corners in Europe that the Trump administration is offering too many concessions to Russia. One of the proposed plans that Trump put out talks about a U.S. de facto or de jure recognition of Crimea, other occupied territories, no Ukraine in NATO, which was a big strategic goal for Ukraine and other allies, no real commitments from the U.S. side on defense and security in the post-war environment. So I guess my question here is, how many concessions is too many concessions to Russia? And at what point does Europe start to really, really get alarmed about the nature of these negotiations?
There is a very simple answer to this question. It is Ukraine that has to decide how many concessions are too much. It's not up to Europe to freak out. We in Europe have a very clear role right now. We haven't earned our place at the negotiating table, but what we can do now is to ensure that Ukraine ends up in the best possible negotiation position. We are actually, in a bizarre way, grateful to the US administration for having broken the ice, as Ambassador Ischinger said at the press conference earlier today. We are looking at it in the hope, and if I understand what the Vice President has said today correctly, in the justified hope that this peace negotiation is not going to reward the aggressor and is not stabbing Ukraine in the back.
Do you think it will? Because there's a lot of concern that some of these early concessions, some of these overtures show exactly that happening.
I was massively concerned ahead of that brief meeting between Zelensky and President Trump in St. Peter's in Rome. I thought after that meeting, the narrative of the president did change quite visibly. And everything I've heard since then, I think, was a little more pushy in Russia's direction. I do believe that the president and his administration know full well that I don't think many Americans want Russia to win this war. I don't think many Americans want the enemy out of the Cold War times to get away with aggression. And I think most Americans are aware of the disastrous signals that would send around the world and how that would be perceived as an invitation for China to take Taiwan and Turkey to take Kurdistan and all sorts of other things. So I am less worried now than I was 3 weeks ago.
And you mentioned Europe's seat at the negotiating table.
Non-existing.
Non-existing, exactly. So, I mean, this has happened on Ukraine. It's happening in these Iran talks. Europe's invite keeps getting lost in the mail. Walk me through a roadmap for Europe to get its invitation to these types of negotiations from an administration that clearly doesn't respect Europe enough to pull up a seat for them.
Yeah. You know, I think it's the totally wrong strategy to sit there and hope to be invited. It should have been us that should have started serious negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. It is our backyard, not the US backyard. On Iran, it's a little difficult. It was our sort of negotiation last time round. It was driven by the EU. It ended in the JCPOA. I think it's a good thing that America is taking the lead now. And we certainly don't need to ask for a place at the table if no one wants us at the table. It brings me to my most important point, and the most important point of this leaders meeting. We Europeans need to get a lot better to persuade the average American and their representatives in Washington that we are a real asset and not a nuisance. And I think for that we need to step up. We need to deliver, and we need to change around the narrative.
So I feel like I've heard we need to step up, we need to deliver.
You've just heard it.
Yeah, I've heard it here.
Me.
I've heard it at Munich in 2024, 2023, 2022, et cetera, going back and back. At what point do you stop the talk and start walking the walk here? And do you think Europe has since this galvanizing speech from Vance in February?
You know, I wish I was better prepared, because then I could now pull out the defense numbers in Europe. I mean, look at how many European nations are now meeting the 2% goal. We're close to, 80% of European nations are now meeting the 2% goal. Some are exceeding it. Look at Germany, where we've been. I've spent a lot of time in the armed forces. And 4 years ago, we spent less than 40 billion per year on defense. It is now close to 100 billion. I mean, I think that is walking the talk, to be perfectly honest. We've bought the F-35. We've bought the Chinooks. We have said we'll increase the size of our military from its current 180,000 to potentially as many as 330,000. We've done a lot. And that was the previous coalition. You will see a much more ambitious German government under Friedrich Merz. And I am 100% sure that isn't lost on people in the administration.
So I want to get to that in a second. But first, I mean, you're giving a pretty positive spin.
It's my job.
Okay, it's your job. I want you to take off your MSC hat for a second. You've given a pretty positive spin on what's happened over the past 3 months, but that is also a 3 months where Trump is openly talking about annexing Greenland, making Canada a 51st state, really roiling transatlantic relations. You have European lawmakers questioning the health of American democracy here. How do you square that circle of what you just said with everything else going on that's emanating from the Trump White House right now?
You know, I do believe several things can be true at once. I believe it can be true that this administration has a strategic objective in increasing European defense capabilities and willingness. I also believe it can be true that at the same time this administration is disruptive. Sometimes strategically so, sometimes tactically so, and sometimes probably unwillingly so. Yes, and this is the last time I'm going to be positive in the last 4 minutes and 13 seconds, I promise. But, you know, I run around the world saying not all disruption is negative. Sometimes you need disruption to unblock things. Sometimes you need disruption to overcome hurdles, like the debt break. We really needed disruption to get over that.
And the debt break being that Germany can spend into debt in order to spend more on defense. Am I getting that right?
Correct,
okay.
Yes. And at the same time, I just wish we would see less of these diversionary outbreaks of the Greenland or Canada nature. The average European, I think, just laughs about it. But you're absolutely right in sort of questioning the fact whether in the process of disrupting, how much trust that our predecessors, mothers, fathers, and so on have built up over the last 50, 60 years, are you actually destroying? And how much is that actually decreasing the value added of what you've made possible? And here, I do believe that today's comments by the Vice President have certainly in Germany, I think, calmed nerves a little. But there is still massive concerns about things that are going on in this country, as I take it. There are still massive concerns in the White House about things that are going on in Germany with our right-wing party, et cetera, et cetera.
Briefly, you have a new government. After a bit of a stumble out of the gate yesterday, Friedrich Merz is new chancellor. Is there an opportunity here to reset U.S.-German relations under Merz's government? There seemed to be, shall I say, some bad blood between the Trump team and Scholz's team. Does it seem like both sides are willing, interested, engaging in trying to do a reset here? How far do you think that can go?
So, having spoken to both sides very recently, yes. I believe, yes, you will see a reset. Friedrich Merz will be coming to Washington very soon. I think we're going to see a phone call between President Trump and Friedrich Merz tomorrow. The team, the national security team in particular of the new German chancellor, is full of long-time Munich Security Conference attendees. To say it as it is, they know their shit. They are actually really good at their job. They know that European security depends on a good relationship with the US. They also know what the legitimate concerns are from the US, and they will address them.
Yeah. Well, that basically slowly wraps up our time here. We had about 18 minutes to solve all transatlantic relations issues, and I feel like we did a pretty good job.
In fact, we could have gone on for a minute and 15 seconds.
How do we fix transatlantic relations, real quick? You've got 1 minute, 9 seconds left.
True story. I think it's all about the narrative. If Americans believe it's worth investing in this relationship, we Europeans need to make the case for it. We are really bad at making the case for the European Union at home. This is why Brexit happened. And we now need to learn the mistakes, or need to learn the lessons from that, and not make the same mistake on the transatlantic relationship. As with every good relationship, you need to work on it every day. You need to invest into it. You need to make the case for it. You need to buy flowers and take her out for dinner. I don't know, you need to do stuff. And that's what we will be doing.
So Europe and the US has to date more.
Yes.
You heard it here first, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time. Stay in your seats because we've got more exciting programming coming.
More exciting than me?
Just as exciting, equally exciting is what I meant to say. We've got Politico's Jack Blanchard, who's sitting down with the Director of Policy Planning with the NATO Secretary General, Benedikt Franke. So please join me in thanking Benedikt here and welcoming our next guests on stage.